The expression on my son's face when he walked through that door, I'll never forget it. He came in ahead of his wife, the way he always does, like he's clearing a path. Then he stopped. Just stopped, right there in the middle of my kitchen, holding a manila envelope under one arm. His wife nearly walked into his back. Neither of them said a word for a full 3 seconds. They were staring at the man sitting across from me at my kitchen table, both hands wrapped around a mug of tea, completely unbothered. My son finally found his voice. "Dad." He cleared his throat. "What is he doing here?" The man at my table, my oldest friend in the world, looked up slowly. He didn't smile. He didn't say anything. He just looked at my son the way a person looks at someone they've already figured out. I picked up my own mug. "Nice to see you too." My son didn't answer. His wife had gone quiet behind him. And standing there in my kitchen, on a gray Tuesday afternoon in February, my son looked more rattled than I had seen him since he was 12 years old, and I caught him lying to my face about where he'd been. Some things don't change. 3 months before that afternoon, I would have driven 40 minutes in a snowstorm just to have him stop by for an hour. It's strange what time does to a person's expectations. My name is Russell Harding. I'm 68 years old. I live in a small 2-story house in Stratford, Ontario, the same house I bought with my wife Pauline in 1989, when the mortgage rate was high enough to make your eyes water. For 32 years, I ran a small commercial painting company. Not glamorous work. Cold sites in April, hot rooftops in July, dealing with general contractors who paid late and building managers who changed their minds on colors after you'd already primed 3 floors. But the work was honest, and the crew was good. And by the time I sold the business, I had enough set aside to retire without worrying every time I bought groceries. When Pauline passed, breast cancer, 6 years ago now, the business kept me upright. Having somewhere to go every morning probably saved me. We had 2 kids. My daughter Wendy lives out in Kelowna now with her husband and 2 girls. My son, his name is Daniel, is 41 and lives about 20 minutes from me in a newer subdivision outside Kitchener. Daniel and I were always close. Closer after Pauline died, at least for a while. He'd come over on Sundays. We'd watch the Leafs lose together, which is a particular kind of Canadian bonding experience. We'd have breakfast at the Madeline House on Downey Street, same corner table, same order for both of us. He was around. Then, gradually, he wasn't. No single moment I can point to. Just a slow drift I kept making excuses for. He was busy. The kids were busy. His wife, her name is Sandra, had a demanding job in Waterloo. Life gets full. I understood that, or I told myself I did. What I couldn't explain away so easily were the questions. They started showing up about a year before any of this came to a head. Casual questions, slipped into phone calls that were already winding down. "How's the house holding up, Dad?" And, "You thinking about maybe selling, getting something smaller?" And once, after I mentioned I'd had a dizzy spell, "Have you talked to anyone about your finances? Like, whether you have a plan in place?" I laughed that one off. I told him I had a plan in place since before he was born. He laughed too, then changed the subject. I didn't think too hard about it at the time. Maybe I didn't want to. The call that changed things came on a Thursday evening in late October. My neighbor across the street, a retired firefighter named Glenn, who has known me for 20 years, rang me up, which he almost never does. Glenn is not a phone person. He'd rather walk over and stand in your driveway. But he called, and after a few minutes of talking about nothing in particular, he got quiet in a way that told me he was working up to something. "I'm going to say something, and I want you to know I thought about it for a week before picking up the phone." I told him to go ahead. Daniel's wife was talking to some people at the Legion last Saturday. One of them mentioned it to my wife. He paused. "She was saying you'd been having some memory issues, some confusion, that you'd had a few incidents." I stood very still. The kitchen felt quiet in a particular way. "What incidents?" I said. "That's what I asked." Nobody seemed to know specifically. Just that she was worried. That things might be getting concerning. I thanked Glenn. I stood there after we hung up, looking out the window at the backyard. The garden Pauline planted was long past its season. The feeders I'd put up for her were empty and cold. I was not confused. I was not having incidents. I had a dizzy spell 5 months ago, and my doctor told me to drink more water. But someone had been saying otherwise. The person I called that night was a man named George Sutton. George and I go back to 1981. We met doing summer work on a construction crew outside Guelph when we were both too young to know better. He became an accountant. I started painting. Over the decades, we stayed in touch the way good friends do. Not constantly, but reliably. Every few months, a call, a visit once or twice a year, dinner when either of us passed through the other's city. George had retired the previous spring and moved back to Ontario from Calgary. We'd been talking about getting together for months, but hadn't managed it yet. I called him at 9:30 on a Thursday night. He answered on the second ring. I told him everything. He listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I've always respected about him. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Russell," he said, "I think you need someone in your corner who understands what they're looking at." I agreed with him. "I can come next week," he said. He arrived the following Tuesday with a thermos of his own coffee and a yellow legal pad. He's always been like that. Organized, methodical, not easily rattled. Within 2 days of sitting at my kitchen table, he'd gone through my financial records, my RRRSP and RRIF documents, my property records, my will, and the beneficiary designations on my life insurance. Everything was in order, because I had kept it in order. But George found something that bothered him. On the third evening, he looked up from a folder and said my name in the tone people use when they have to say something they'd rather not. "What?" I said. He slid a piece of paper across the table. It was a printout he'd obtained through a contact at a financial institution. Nothing private, nothing improperly accessed, just documentation of an inquiry. Someone had called a financial services line, asking about the process for a family member to obtain decision-making authority over an elderly parent's financial accounts when the parent was believed to be experiencing cognitive decline. The call had been made in September. I looked at the paper for a long time. George said, "It might be nothing." "You don't think it's nothing?" I said. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. I thought about Pauline. I thought about the house she had loved, the garden she planted. The mornings we sat at the same kitchen table, where George and I were now sitting, drinking coffee before the kids woke up. I thought about 32 years of early mornings and cold job sites and honest work. And then I thought about my son. I slept badly that week. George and I started talking through what we actually knew versus what I was assuming. We were careful about that. I didn't want to accuse anyone unfairly. Daniel was my son. Whatever was happening, he was still my son. But the picture that was assembling itself was difficult to dismiss. I started paying closer attention to the conversations we'd been having over the past year. I wrote them down, date by date, as best I could remember them. The questions about the house, the questions about my finances, the suggestion, twice now, that I consider giving someone power of attorney, which in itself is perfectly reasonable advice but felt different in context. And then Sandra telling people at the Legion that I was having memory problems. There's a particular kind of hurt that comes with that realization, not the sharp kind, the slow kind, the kind that settles in and stays. I had another source of information I hadn't expected. A former employee of mine named Pete, who'd worked with my crew for 15 years before I sold the business. Pete has a way of knowing things, not gossip exactly, just information that seems to find him. He called me about something unrelated, and at the end of the call mentioned he'd run into Daniel's brother-in-law at a home show in Cambridge. The brother-in-law had apparently been talking about real estate, investment properties, using equity from family assets as leverage. The phrase family assets had been used specifically. I didn't own anything I would call a family asset. I owned my house, my car, and my retirement savings, all of which were mine. I sat with that conversation for 2 days before I said anything to George. When I did, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What do you want to do?" That was the right question, and it took me longer than I expected to answer it. Daniel called in late November and suggested we get together before the holidays. He mentioned he had some paperwork he'd like me to take a look at. Just some planning documents, he said. Things everyone should have sorted out. He said his wife would come along and that they'd also be bringing someone, a financial planner, he called him, who could walk me through everything. I said that sounded fine. I did not mention George. The meeting was set for a Tuesday afternoon. I made tea. I had shortbread on a plate. My house was clean and quiet and ordinary looking. George arrived an hour early and sat down at my kitchen table with his mug. When Daniel and Sandra came through the door, the financial planner behind them, I heard the sound of Sandra's voice cutting off mid-sentence. Then silence. 3 full seconds of it. Daniel said my name. Then he said, "What is he doing here?" And that's where we came in. The man they'd brought along, his name was Neil, well-dressed, a little younger than Daniel, carrying a slim leather briefcase, looked immediately uncomfortable. The kind of uncomfortable that comes from realizing you've walked into something you don't fully understand. George set his mug down on the table. He said, "Good to see you, Daniel. It's been a while." Sandra's expression was difficult to read. She'd gone very still. Daniel turned to me. "Dad, when did you call him?" I pulled out a chair. "Sit down, I made tea." Nobody sat right away. It took a moment. The 4 of us eventually settled at the table. Neil took a chair near the door, slightly apart, which I thought said something about his instincts. Daniel placed the manila envelope on the table. He started to explain. Routine planning, getting ahead of things, making sure I was protected. I listened. When he finished, I said I appreciated the thought, and that I would not be signing anything that day. I said I wanted to have everything reviewed by my own lawyer before I signed anything at all. Sandra started to say something. George looked at her. She stopped. The meeting lasted less than 30 minutes. When Daniel and Sandra stood to leave, Daniel paused at the door and looked back at me. He didn't look angry. That surprised me. He looked, for just a moment, like a person who knows he's been caught, but hasn't decided yet what to do with that feeling. Then he left. The door closed. George and I sat in the kitchen. Outside, a light snow had started to fall. "Well," George said. "Yeah," I said. We didn't say much else for a while. In the days after that meeting, I went through the documents Daniel had brought. Carefully, line by line, with my kitchen light on and a pencil in my hand, the way I used to go over contracts. What they contained was not dramatic. That was the first thing that struck me. They were professionally formatted, clean language, organized with little colored tabs. If you were reading quickly or trusting the person who handed them to you, they would have looked like standard planning paperwork. George sat across from me and read his copy. What the documents would have done, had I signed them, was give Daniel broad decision-making authority over my financial accounts, under conditions that could be claimed rather than objectively verified. The language around cognitive decline was vague in a way that wasn't accidental. George marked 3 different sections with his pen. "This gives him a lot of room," George said. "How much room?" He looked at me over his reading glasses. "Enough." I called my own lawyer, a woman named Patricia Chen, who had handled the sale of my business, the next morning. She reviewed everything and called me back that afternoon. "Russell," she said, "whoever drafted these was not looking out for your interests." I thanked her. I asked what she'd recommend. She told me. Over the next several weeks, I made a series of decisions, not out of anger. With a clear head, the way I'd made business decisions my whole life. You gather information, you look at what you have, you figure out what makes sense. I updated my will. I restructured how my assets were held, moving the bulk into a formal trust arrangement that Patricia helped me establish. My house, which I had been quietly putting on the market for 2 months by that point, sold in January to a young family from Waterloo. I moved to a rented condo on the edge of Victoria Park in Kitchener. 2 bedrooms, a parking spot, a view of the park through the living room window. Small, comfortable, mine. I did not tell Daniel any of this. I decided on Christmas. Not for drama. I want to be honest about that. I chose Christmas because it was already happening. I'd been hosting the family holiday dinner for years, and canceling would have raised questions I wasn't ready to answer yet. Both my children would be there. Wendy was flying in from Kelowna with her family. Some extended family, a few longtime friends from the neighborhood. It felt like the right time to say what needed to be said, quietly, in front of the people who mattered most. The day was cold and clear, the kind of Ontario Christmas that looks exactly like it's supposed to. I cooked a roast. The house smelled like it always had on December 25th. George came early and helped with the potatoes, which he is surprisingly good at. Wendy arrived with the girls just after noon, and for a few hours everything was warm and ordinary. Daniel and Sandra arrived at 2. They hugged me. Sandra commented on how nice the house looked, which it did, because I had spent 3 days making sure it did. Daniel shook George's hand at the door with the careful politeness of a man who is doing the math on a situation he doesn't control. The afternoon went along. The girls helped set the table. Someone put a hockey game on in the background. My neighbor Glenn and his wife came over for dessert as they had every year since Pauline died. It was, in every visible way, normal. After dinner, when everyone had plates of butter tarts and coffee and the table had that comfortable end-of-meal feeling, I stood up. I didn't tap a glass. I just said I wanted to say a few things. Conversations wound down. Everyone looked at me. I told them I had spent the last several months getting my affairs in order. I said that during that process, some things had come to my attention that I wanted to address openly, with the people I trusted most, rather than letting them sit. I watched Daniel set down his coffee cup. I did not raise my voice. I didn't accuse anyone of anything dramatic. I simply told the truth in order. I mentioned that I had heard, through more than one person, that questions were being raised about my cognitive health. Questions I had not been told about directly. I mentioned the documents that had been brought to me in November. I described what those documents would have allowed. I described the inquiry George had found. The room was very quiet. Wendy looked at me, then at Daniel. Her expression shifted through several things. Daniel said, "Dad, that's not how it was." I asked him how it was. He didn't have an answer that held together. Sandra started to say something about concern, about wanting to be practical, about how these things are complicated. She wasn't wrong that these things are complicated, but complicated isn't the same as acceptable. Then her brother, who had been invited because he comes every year, who didn't fully know what he was walking into, said something that landed like a stone in the middle of the table. He had been quiet all afternoon, but he'd had a bit of wine. And people who've had a bit of wine sometimes say out loud what they've been thinking privately. Well, is there even anything left to worry about? The question hung in the air. George looked at the table. Glenn's wife looked at her butter tart. Wendy looked at her husband. Daniel looked at his brother-in-law as though he could somehow take the words back for him. I let the silence do its work for a moment. Then I said, "That's an interesting question." I reached beside my chair for a folder, not for effect, just because I had prepared for this and wanted to be accurate. I told him I had sold the house in January. I watched Daniel's face. "The sale closed 2 weeks ago," I said. "The family moves in on the 15th. Sandra made a small sound. "I've restructured my finances into a trust," I continued. "My lawyer helped me set it up properly, with appropriate protections and clear terms about how the assets are managed and by whom." Daniel said, "Dad, George isn't a beneficiary," I said, in case that's what anyone's wondering. A few people at the table relaxed slightly at that. A few didn't. "The trust will fund 2 things," I said. "First, a scholarship at Conestoga College for students going into skilled trades, plumbing, electrical, painting, carpentry. The kind of work that kept this family going for 30 years. I paused. "The rest will go to Wendy's girls in trust when they're old enough to do something real with it." Wendy looked at me. Her eyes were wet. She hadn't known either. Daniel sat back in his chair. He looked, in that moment, older than 41. Not angry. Something that takes longer to name. The look of someone who has just understood the distance between what they planned and what actually happened. His brother-in-law stared at the tablecloth. Sandra didn't say anything more. I sat back down. The room stayed quiet for a bit. Then Glenn said something low and kind to his wife, and the girls asked if there were more butter tarts, and slowly the room found its way back to something resembling itself, smaller and a little raw around the edges, but still there. Daniel and Sandra left before 7. He hugged me at the door. It was brief. I let it be what it was. After they left, Wendy stood beside me in the kitchen while I rinsed dishes. For a while, she didn't say anything. Then she said, "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "I didn't want to put you in the middle," I said. "I'm already in the middle, Dad. I'm always in the middle." She wasn't wrong about that either. The weeks after Christmas were quiet. I settled into the condo. I learned where the light fell at different times of day, which is one of the things you notice when you move somewhere new. I took walks in Victoria Park in the mornings. I started going back to the Legion on Thursday evenings, which I'd stopped doing after Pauline died, and found that I'd missed it more than I realized. George went back to his place in Guelph. We talked on the phone twice a week, which is more than we'd managed in years. I did not hear from Daniel for a long time. I thought about him more than I expected. Not with anger. With something more complicated than that. When you're a father, you spend years believing your job is to protect your children. You do it without thinking, the way you breathe. It takes time to accept that protection sometimes has to work in the other direction. I thought about the years when Daniel was small. The way he'd follow me around job sites on weekends, wearing one of my old ball caps that swallowed his head. The time he cried for 20 minutes because he thought he'd broken a paintbrush and was scared to tell me. The year he graduated from college and shook my hand like a man, and I had to look away for a moment because I was proud in a way I didn't have the words for. I thought about all of that, and I didn't stop loving him. I just stopped pretending the situation was something it wasn't. I almost called him 4 or 5 times in January. I picked up the phone and put it back down, not because I was holding a grudge, because I needed whatever came next to come from the right place. Not from guilt, not from the habit of smoothing things over, not from the old impulse to keep everyone comfortable at my own expense. The right time would come, or it wouldn't. Either way, I was going to be fine. He called in March. It was a Wednesday, late afternoon. I was back from my walk and had just put the kettle on. I looked at the call display and stood there for a moment before I answered. His voice was different, quieter. He asked if I had a few minutes. I said I did. We talked about nothing at first. The weather, a hockey trade that neither of us really cared about, the stilted back and forth of two people finding their way back to each other's voices. Then he said, "I'm sorry, Dad." He didn't say it quickly. He didn't attach any qualifications to it. He said it and let it be what it was. I didn't say anything right away, he continued. He said he had told himself for months that what he was doing was practical, that he was being responsible, that he was planning ahead for a situation that might someday exist. He said he'd repeated that to himself often enough that he'd stopped examining whether it was true. Sandra and I were in a tough spot, he said, financially. For a while, I didn't want to admit how bad it was. Not to you, not to anyone. He paused. That's not an excuse. I know it's not. I looked out at the park. The snow had melted enough that you could see the grass starting to come through, that particular shade of March green that always looks slightly unreal, like the color's been turned up too high. I should have told you, I said, years ago. When things got strained between us, I should have asked harder questions instead of letting it drift. He was quiet for a moment. That's not on you. Some of it is. Neither of us spoke for a while. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind that comes when two people are being honest, and neither has anything quick or easy to add. Eventually, he asked if we could get together sometime. I said yes. We made no specific plan that night. But we said we would, and we meant it. After we hung up, I sat for a while with a mug of tea that had gone slightly cold. Outside, the park was settling into the blue-gray light of a March evening. A couple walked a dog along the path. 2 kids kicked a soccer ball toward nothing in particular. For a long time, I'd been carrying a kind of weight I'd gotten so used to that I'd stopped noticing it. The worry, the uncertainty, the quiet grief of watching a relationship change and not understanding why. It was lighter now. Not gone, but lighter. I thought about Pauline. I thought about what she would have made of all this. She was always the one who could hold 2 things at once without needing to resolve them into something simpler. She would have been sad about it. She also would have told me that people are capable of more than you expect from them, if you give it enough time. I think she would have been right. There's something I've come to understand through all of this. It took longer than it should have, maybe. But here it is. You can love your children without making yourself smaller for them. You can hold the door open without handing over the keys to your house. You can forgive someone and still require that they understand what they did. These are not contradictions. And your life, the one you built, the choices you made, the work you put in for 40 years, that belongs to you. It always did. It still does. What you do with it is still yours to decide.